So I was just talking with Erskine Bowles briefly, and he described you as the most knowledgeable guy about budget issues in the Senate, which is a big compliment coming.
That's not saying much.
Erskine Bowles. So then give us your take on the budget deal that was crafted between Patty Murray and Paul Ryan and how far you think it takes us on this issue.
Well, I voted for it and supported it and had the opportunity to talk to Paul during the process. I think it was necessary, and I think it began this process that is necessary of shifting some of the focus from the discretionary side to the mandatory side. Because in essence what it did was it said we're going to relieve some of sequester by taking some cost increases out of the mandatory side of the budget, which is by far the biggest part of the budget and the fastest growing part of the budget, and shift it over to the domestic discretionary side, including national defense and other programs and departments of government. So I think that theory is sound, and clearly that's one of the problems. The mandatory side being 2/3 of the budget. Within 10 years, it'll be 77% of the budget. So it's growing by about 100% over the next 10 years, according to the Congressional Budget Office. So clearly that's one of the issues. Where I was disappointed with that agreement, as you know, is that it didn't do enough to deal with the even midterm, much less long-term fiscal problem that we face. And so I was hoping we could do at least a baby step in that direction.
Right.
We sort of took the low-hanging fruit from the, again, mandatory side of the budget, but didn't deal with the underlying problem.
And there was even some pushback from members of both parties to some of that low-hanging fruit being plucked, notably when it comes to something that the Pentagon had recommended, which is scaling back some benefits to retirees that had to be rolled back. So if even those kinds of things are not going to make it, how do you push for an even bigger deal that goes beyond the low-hanging fruit?
Well, I think there were some other steps that could have been taken that I think would have survived the political gauntlet if the president had supported, for instance, what was in his own budget with regard to means testing. In other words, telling folks who are retired, who make over a certain amount, about $170,000 a year as a couple, that they'd have to pay a little more for prescription drugs, Part D, Part B, the hospital visits. If you would have put that in place, essentially telling them they have to pay a little higher premiums, you would have seen significant savings, about $60 billion over 10 years based on the president's budget. And importantly, you would have seen over the next 10 years probably $450 billion of savings based on what Erskine Bowles has done, and he's done some great work in this area. So it's the classic example of something where you make relatively small changes today. In this case, again, means testing or affluence testing, but it has enormous impacts in the out years, which is obviously what we have to do. So if we had been able to get the president to simply support his own budget with regard to that, I think we could have made a step in the right direction, and I think that would have helped to restore a little trust between the parties and do more than just the low-hanging fruit, which was relatively small changes. We have another opportunity, though, coming, Nancy, which is probably what you want to ask me about next, which is that, you know, in 2016, this comes up again, which means we have to deal with it in 2015, which is after the election. And I think we got to take full advantage of 2015, particularly the first 6 months of that year, when maybe there'll be a little less politics, I hope, to try to make some of these changes and do it, again, with the administration working with Congress.
So how do you see that process working then? Because we saw with the Super Committee, for example, which you were a part of, that 3 months of hardcore negotiations was not enough to break the impasse. So how much time do you think we do need to craft something significant? Who needs to be involved? Does it need to be more insulated from politics? Does it need to be more open than it was before? What's the magic bullet here?
Well, the Super Committee that I was part of turned out to be not so super, and it was a hard process. I do think the time frame was relatively short, and I think, frankly, we didn't have the support, again, of the White House to provide cover to Democrats to make tough decisions. And, you know, I said that at the time. I still believe that's very true. I think it requires presidential leadership. It also requires leadership on the Republican side, no question about it. But if you don't have both, you're not going to get to the result. So I look at what happened with Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton back in the 90s. I look at what happened with Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill back in the 80s. The only times you can really point to where we've made some significant changes, they did happen during times of divided government. You know, each leadership sort of gave their own members some political cover. And I think that's really the key. So that was not present in the super committee. We also had some other issues in the super committee that were related to the time frame being short and a deadline. On the other hand, we made enough progress there and have made more progress since in terms of looking at these issues that I don't think we would need as much time if we, again, had the political will to get to a result. So my sense is, regardless of who wins the majority in the Senate, and I think there's a good chance that could change, I think we've got to figure out a way to re-engage with the talks that Speaker Boehner and the President had at one point, and make sure that we have inclusion from the Senate side as well, and put some of these issues on the table that are, again, not easy to deal with, but where we can take at least a first step toward dealing with this longer-term problem. By the way, I saw in some of your material that the notion is that the debt and deficit is no longer a big issue. It's not going to play in 2014, and it's all because the deficits have gone down a little bit. But the fact is that based on independent analysis, nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, we're looking at trillion-dollar deficits, again, within the next 10 years. So, one, $500 billion seems like an awfully big number to me. Our deficit this year is nothing to be proud of. But more importantly, as the baby boomers begin to retire, my generation, we're going to see these numbers escalate, and everybody knows that it's not a secret. So there shouldn't be any easing off of the political pressure on those of us who are elected to get something done up here. Instead, there should be a lot of focus in 2014. I hope there will be in these races around the country. It's a midterm, so there's no presidential election, but House races and Senate races. And people ought to be asked, you know, do you think this is a big issue, and what are you going to do about it? Because it does affect our economy today, and certainly it's unfair, even immoral, to do to future generations.
Democrats would argue that, you know, they're willing to make some painful choices, but that Republicans aren't willing to give on increasing tax revenue, or that they might make a deal with you in some room about making tax revenue part of the agreement, but then it's going to be impossible to sell, particularly to House Republicans.
Well, House Republicans are not all of one mind on taxes. That's true. But I think there is a consensus about tax reform, and I think particularly pro-growth tax reform that will kick off more revenue. It'll do so through growth, and I think if we had some analysis of that, this is why I've pushed that, and actually in the last budget that the Senate did, which was not this year but last year, the only budget we've done in 5 years, so it's easy to remember. That was a hit, thank you. But we got an amendment that I offered that said let's use the macroeconomic analysis as well as the static score analysis for tax reform, and it passed with 53 votes. So I do think there's an interest now in looking at, you know, how do you put together tax reform that is pro-growth, and how do you take some of those pro-growth revenues and use them toward deficit reduction. But the other problem that, you know, Democrats don't like to face up to sometimes is the fact that over the next 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years, from any historical perspective, the tax revenues are not the problem. Next year we'll get back to 18%, which is the traditional percent of the economy that taxes take out, and then it grows from there. So we're looking at, over the next decade, probably historically high levels of taxation as a percent of the economy, and yet the spending soars to the point that over the next 25 or 30 years, no tax system can catch it, unless you have a different tax system. But our income tax system simply could not generate enough income regardless of how high the rates were. So that's when people like me say, this is a spending problem we have to deal with. Admittedly, tax reform is part of how you deal with this because you need growth, you need to have the growth revenues, but also economic growth generally.
So then why isn't tax reform happening? I mean, you're on the Finance Committee. Theoretically, this relationship between Dave Camp and Max Baucus should be kind of a model for cooperation between Democrats and Republicans. They've been talking to each other for years, and then they go back and tell their conferences what they've done. And Dave Camp is well respected among Republicans in the House. He came up with what seemed to be a very thoughtful tax reform, very comprehensive plan, and it got 5 minutes of attention, and now it's basically dead.
Well, I commend Dave Camp for doing that, because he showed what it takes to get to a lower tax rate, and there's some tough decisions that have to be made, but the macroeconomic impact of that is very positive, and so I think it was a real service that he did that. Not everybody's going to agree with every part of it, nor do I, but I think there are lots of people talking about tax reform now, and probably we're in a mode a little bit like '86, where it took about 3 years to get to tax reform, and we've taken the first step. I think next year would be an opportunity. You mentioned Max Baucus. He's no longer around here. He's now, he took the slow boat to China, as I tell him, to get away from all of us here. But Ron Wyden is here, and Ron Wyden is the Democrat chairman of the Finance Committee now. He's for tax reform. Orrin Hatch is the ranking Republican, likely to be the chairman if Republicans get the majority. He's for tax reform. So we have not lost leadership. The next chairman of the Ways and Means Committee maybe somebody who usually speaks at this conference who's for tax reform. I'm not predicting who it's going to be. I guess that's like House politics I should stay out of, but it may be Paul Ryan. And so those are people, all of whom agree that if you lower the rate and broaden the base, you can drive the economy toward higher revenues through growth. It's a fundamental decision they have made. The question is, how do you put together the details? I think it's doable. And by the way, if we don't do it, particularly on the business side, the corporate side, we will continue to lose jobs and opportunity. And we see it now. You've seen what Walgreens is talking about and Pfizer.
Right.
The fact is, every day we are losing more and more American companies, either overseas, or American companies are not growing because they are losing out on acquisitions because our tax code disadvantages American companies vis-a-vis companies from other countries that have both a lower rate and a more competitive international system. So we better get busy on that quickly before we continue to hemorrhage jobs and investment.
So since it seems like comprehensive tax reform isn't going to happen at least any time in the next few months, could you do something like that? I mean, do you have to do this all at once, or could you tackle something like corporate tax reform by itself, or, you know, little pieces, or could you eliminate some loopholes, for example, that everyone agrees are wasteful by themselves? Or do you have to wait until you can have this huge give and take between the two parties and they all take a bullet and they, you know, everyone jumps in together?
It would be better to do it all together for two simple reasons. One is to lower that rate. You want to get rid of these preferences together rather than getting rid of preferences now and not having the ability to have on a static score basis, revenue neutral, which is what the president's talked about in terms of corporate tax reform, for instance, and certainly Republicans like me support. But second, and I think importantly, most companies don't organize under the C corporation. They're pass-through entities, subchapter S and sole proprietors and partnerships and stuff. And so if you just take away their preferences, don't lower their rate, it's not fair to them. And so you probably need to do the two tax systems together, the C and the individual. And that certainly is doable. I mean, I think Dave Camp laid out a proposal to do it, to get to 25%. Others have other ideas. Ron Wyden has a proposal, for instance. So I do think that's part of pulling all this together. Dealing with the debt and deficit includes, of course, the spending we talked about earlier, and the fact that on the mandatory side in particular, you have to deal with the entitlements. Vital programs, but must be reformed in order for them to be sustained over time. But second, I do think there is this revenue side of it, which comes from growth, not just tax reform, but other things that are pro-growth, and they do come together. And I'm hopeful that next year that can happen. I will say that the dynamic in this town is pretty poison right now. And having just gone through this week with the energy efficiency bill, that was, to me, a no-brainer. We should have done it. Something I've worked on for 3 years, so it's a disappointing week. We need to change that dynamic. And some of it is, you know, about politics in an election year. So hopefully that will subside in 2015. But part of it is just a decision by people to say, because they're hearing from Pete Peterson and others in this room that this is important, that, you know, we're going to achieve a result and not just talk about it and play politics with it.
So how do you change that? Because you're one of the reasonable ones, and there are a lot of reasonable folks who want to get things done. But one thing you hear a lot in Congress is, well, there's just not enough trust. There's not enough trust between the two sides to do anything difficult like tax reform or entitlement reform. And I think as reporters, we tend to sort of say, oh, come on, that's just an excuse. But is that really getting in the way of getting anything done? And if so, how do you change that? It's always going to be an election year or about to be an election year.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And again, what I talked about earlier was some confidence-building steps. I think what Patty Murray and Paul Ryan did was a positive step in that direction in terms of this issue of deficits and debts, and I commend them both for it. But I think taking that next step and actually dealing with the mandatory side in a more serious way and dealing with this longer-term fiscal crisis, Erskine Bowles, who's here with us today, says something that I plagiarize all the time, which is this is the most predictable economic crisis in the history of our country. And it is because there is eventually going to be a reckoning and a financial crisis that may make the last one we just went through several years ago look relatively small if we don't deal with it. So this is, I think, after the election, probably, not before the election, but after the election, a real opportunity for us. And what can help drive it, as I said earlier, is the fact that the agreement on the sequester is only for the period of 2015 and 2016. It has to be addressed. So writing the appropriations bills, even in 2015, we need to have some resolution of this. So I think there's an opportunity, again, first 6 months, let's make a commitment to do it, regardless of who wins the majority in the Senate, which I think, again, is pretty much up in the air.
Do you think that would make a big difference on these issues, whether Democrats or Republicans control the Senate?
You might not be surprised by my answer to this.
But I mean, you've got a Democrat in the White House either way.
You're going to have a Democrat in the White House either way, and I do think if you look at the history of our great country, where we tend to make these big decisions and where it's politically viable is with divided government. And not saying that you can't do it as all Republicans or all Democrats, but it tends to work out more like Obamacare, which continues to be so contentious, and less like the changes to Social Security that Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill agreed to. And the next year, both parties went on to win plenty of elections. Ronald Reagan won, I think, 49 states because they provided each other the cover, and it wasn't a campaign or political issue. So that, I think, is the model. I believe that if there were a Senate majority of Republicans, that it would be more likely that President Obama would come to the table, and it would, of course, be incumbent upon Republicans in the Senate and in the House to work together to have a more unified agenda, and then to also do the outreach, because it takes two to tango. But that's my view. Some in the Republican caucus think I'm the most naive person in Washington to believe that, but hope springs eternal. And look, these problems aren't going away. The President wisely named the Fiscal Commission. Erskine Bowles, Alan Simpson did an excellent job. That was not followed through on. The super committee, I believe, having served on that, was not supported in the way it could have and should have been, particularly the Democrats. And the President's own budget, he backed off on change CPI in this last budget. So we're not heading in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So I do think changing the dynamic through a new majority certainly holds the promise of something different. And I'm, again, maybe naive, I hope just hopeful and optimistic, right, that would change the dynamic enough to try to get to some solutions.
I would assume that probably the thing you think is most important to tackle is entitlement reform when it comes to, structural reduction in the debt and the deficit. So what do you think Congress can and should do? Do you support Paul Ryan's plan, or do you have a different idea? What do you think should be done and is realistic to be done?
Well, I think longer-term health care costs and quality, and I know I mentioned Peterson earlier, and he indicated to me today that he's starting a new organization to focus on that, which is terrific, because that is the issue with Medicaid and Medicare in particular, which will increase by more than 100% in the next 10 years. And as you know, Medicaid is primarily now an issue that relates to seniors as well. So that issue, that's the big issue that we all need to grapple with, and mm-hmm. whatever that can be done in the short term in terms of wellness, prevention, focused on outcomes, not on input, in other words, not paying more for volume, but right, changing the dynamics in the healthcare system is important. But to be more specific, on Social Security and Medicare, the President has laid out in his own budget 2 ideas. I talked about them earlier. One is means testing, which you could you could do in Part B and Part D, consistent with what the President has talked about. You can also do more. But that's certainly one where I think there's a good possibility of some bipartisan agreement. And second would be having an accurate measure of inflation as to the CPI. But I also think, Congress has the ability, with both sides involved and engaged, to do more, right. Along with the tax reform we talked about earlier. And that's the mix. That's the key ingredients to be able to go back to our constituents and say, we actually helped to address this issue. We didn't solve all the problems, but we changed the trajectory enough that there is now some hope that these programs will not be unsustainable and that they won't collapse on the very people that need them the most. If you think about it, people who are retiring today, most of those people will be alive when Social Security, which is the last of the 3 trust funds that gets in trouble, the Old Age Trust Fund, goes insolvent to the point that there's a 25% cut under law in their benefits. Most of the people alive today. This is happening right now. The Disabilities Trust Fund, of course, goes belly up within a couple years, and Medicare in between the two. But by 2035, we're looking at the Social Security Trust Fund, again, having this 25% cut. So these are real issues that affect us today. It is immoral to do for future generations to leave them holding the bag, and our excesses here today, spending more than we take in every year, we should not be leaving to our kids and our grandkids. So I do hope that I'm not just naive, but that I'm right, that there will be a change in the dynamic and that we can get busy on this early in 2015. Whatever we can do this year is great, but I think, frankly, the political climate, as we saw this week on the energy efficiency bill, may be more dominant than anything else. But, let's have an election, and let's all make a commitment that regardless of what happens, that we address this issue in the first part of 2015.
I have a question for you from the audience. Why is discretionary spending always targeted for cuts when mandatory spending is largely responsible for the long-term debt?
I think I planted that question. Thank you very much. No, I mean, it's true. Infrastructure spending and research and certainly our national defense are all going to be squeezed more and more and more unless we do something. So, some of the programs that Democrats cherish the most are the very ones that are under pressure, and I would hope that would get folks to focus more on, how do you come up with a sustainable way to deal with the obvious problem, which is the massive growth we're seeing on the mandatory side, to the point that from the 1960s, where it was a quarter of the budget, we're now talking about it being 2/3 of the budget today and 3/4 of the budget in 10 years. So it's the big challenge of our time, and as I mentioned earlier, the healthcare component of that is the biggest part. And I do again commend Pete Peterson and others who are saying, let's focus on quality and cost, which are not inconsistent, and come up with ways to avoid having the squeeze on the discretionary side.
Do you agree with Senator Murray, who was out here earlier, who said that if we don't start spending more and spending smarter on repairing our infrastructure and on being more competitive in education, that we're going to hurt our fiscal outlook in the long run because we just won't be able to keep up with other nations?
I think we need to reform all of our basic institutions of our economy, and since she mentioned education, I don't think it's a matter of more money. I think it's a matter of reforming the system. We already spend per pupil more money than most other countries, and yet our results are continuing to drop. So this is an area where we're going to have disagreements as to what we ought to do, but we ought to be able to agree that we need to focus more on the STEM disciplines. We need to put in place more incentives for the system to be able to take care of the kids who are being left behind. Some of our schools are terrific, some of the best in the world, and yet there's a huge gap. And those tend to be public schools. They tend to be in poor neighborhoods. And so this is part of what's causing this growth in poverty, which has grown in the last 4 years to the point that probably among folks who are in deep poverty, which would be 50% of the poverty line, we're at the highest percentage that we've been in since we've started keeping track. So I do think it's a big issue, but I don't know that money solves that one. Infrastructure is a little different. And I, per my comment earlier, we need to invest more in infrastructure, but that gets crowded out as we don't deal with these other issues. So to my friend Patty Murray, I don't disagree that we need to figure out a way to make sure the Highway Trust Fund is solvent, which is another issue which will come up this year. But to do that with more general revenues, simply means we're going further into debt and deficit. And it just begs the question, why aren't we dealing with this largest, fastest growing part of the budget if we want to provide some more relief for infrastructure, research, education, other things on the discretionary side?
Got it. Well, Senator Portman, I hope you are right and that you are not naive, and that when we meet again at this time next year, that Congress will be deep into a negotiation and discussion over the budget and debt and deficit and tax reform, which I know many reporters have been dying to cover for years.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nancy.